Have you ever heard silence so thick it makes your ears ring? That's what hit me the moment I stepped into the Peoria Public Library. The library was a cathedral of stillness after hours, every sound amplified against the stone and brick of its structure. Main branch for floors of books and local history, dating back to the 1800s. My supervisor placed my badge and building keys on the table. "You just need to get used to your new job," he said. I started my shift at 11:45 p.m., just as the cleaning crew was wheeling out their carts, nodding at me with the dead-eyed fatigue of people who'd seen too many things in too many places. The last cleaner, a woman with gray streaks in her braid, paused before leaving. "Stick to the main floor until after midnight," she said without meeting my eyes. "And don't answer if you hear knocking from the archives vault." That was the first odd thing. The second came in the form of a handwritten note tucked into the bottom drawer of the security desk. The paper was creased, yellowed, and looked like it had been written in haste. The title was underlined 3 times. "Rules for the night shift, Peoria Public Library, Main Branch. Rule 1. At exactly 12:12 a.m., the 3rd floor printer will activate. Do not approach it. Let it print what it must. Rule 2. If you find a book open on the floor with no one around, close it immediately and place it on the nearest shelf without reading the title. Rule 3. If the furniture in the director's office starts to move by itself, don't react. Light a candle at the entrance to the room and lock the door behind you. Do not return until 2 a.m. Rule 4. The elevator will occasionally stop on half-second floor. You are not cleared to access this floor. If the doors open, press the close button and recite the alphabet backward. Rule 5. If the library catalog computer searches something on its own, let it finish. Do not touch the keyboard until the screen goes black. Rule 6. If you see a tall man in an outdated librarian's uniform shelving books, do not interrupt him. Leave that floor immediately. Rule 7. Between 3 o'clock and 3:30 a.m., you may hear knocking from inside the archives vault. It is imperative that you do not respond, especially if it knows your name. Rule 8. If the lights flicker continuously, power down the building from the breaker room and wait 77 seconds. The final rule was in a different handwriting, spidery and frantic, written vertically in the margin. Rule 9. If you break a rule, do not run. It hears motion. I didn't believe any of it, of course. Probably just some elaborate hazing tradition passed down through guards with too much free time. Still, as the old brass clock on the wall ticked past midnight, I stayed behind the desk, just for caution's sake. Outside the heavy windows, downtown Peoria lay hushed beneath the stars. Inside the library, the overhead lights buzzed faintly, and a strange tension settled into my shoulders. The sense that something was watching not from the shadows, but from behind the very walls themselves. I hadn't intended to keep checking the time, but my eyes were drawn to the blinking digits of the break room wall clock, as though they might suddenly slip into something unfamiliar. When it turned 12:11 a.m., I stood without thinking, the paper cup of burnt coffee still half full in my hand. I left it steaming quietly on the table and walked back into the hall, my boots echoing in a space that always seemed a little too large after midnight. The library's 3rd floor was the reference section, dense with rows of encyclopedias, historical archives, and long-forgotten city records no one touched anymore. It had that antiseptic chill of old paper and disuse. The smell of it made the hairs rise on my neck before I'd even reached the landing. At 12:12 a.m., right on cue, I heard it. The soft whir of the 3rd floor printer came to life in the silence, like something exhaling after a long sleep. One page, another, then a 3rd slid neatly into the output tray, as if someone invisible were standing just behind the machine. I remained at the top of the staircase, watching through the narrow window in the stairwell door. The lights were dimmed, as they always were at night, but the overhead fluorescence above the printer flickered once, as the machine continued its work. I stood there, just beyond the glass, watching the machine finish its work. 3 more pages, followed by a hiss as the printer stopped. It gave a mechanical sigh and went still, leaving behind a curled stack of paper that no one would claim and file. Silence returned like a heavy blanket. At that moment, I'd broken Rule 1. I hadn't meant to. I didn't believe in any of it yet. I'd gone up to the printer out of habit, picked up the paper, and tried to make sense of what was written. It had looked like cataloging data at first. Dates, names, book titles. But then, one entry caught my eye. My name, followed by a timestamp. 12:12 a.m., just like now. I dropped the pages without realizing it. Just before I turned to go, something shifted behind the printer. Not a movement exactly, more like a ripple in the air, as if the library itself were stretching. A brief, malformed shadow flickered across the opposite wall. I didn't wait to see more. When I made it back down to the second floor, I spent the next 20 minutes checking each floor with the quiet dread of someone moving through the husk of a living thing. The silence in the library wasn't merely the absence of noise. It felt cultivated, like the hush in a tomb. I knew it well by now. The creak of the south stairwell, the faint electrical buzz from the study lamps in the reading alcove, and the distant hum of the boiler as it groaned awake beneath the basement floor. But when I stepped into the children's section on the first floor, something was wrong. There was a smell, dusty, almost sweet, like old flowers long dead in a sealed box. At the center of the aisle, between the oversized encyclopedias and the fairy tale anthologies, was an open book, lying face up on the carpet. I hadn't heard anyone come in. No footsteps, no movement. The book had simply appeared. It was thick and ancient, the kind of volume that didn't belong in this section, its spine frayed and stitched in what looked like some sort of aged leather. I stood there longer than I should have, transfixed by the impossible presence of it. A faint breeze, where from, I couldn't say, ruffled the yellowing pages. And though I was too far to see the title, I found my eyes drifting toward the open text, my feet sliding forward of their own accord. Then I remembered Rule 2. If you find a book open on the floor with no one around, close it immediately and place it on the nearest shelf without reading the title. There was something deeply unnatural about the way the book rested on the carpet, splayed like a trap set for a mind rather than a body. I looked away, fixating on the worn carpet fibers and the edge of a nearby bookshelf, and took a slow, measured breath. The moment my fingers touched the cover, I felt a faint resistance, like the book didn't want to be shut. The paper inside trembled beneath my touch as if something breathed through it. But I didn't yield. I closed it firmly, and without lifting it to read the cover, slid it onto the shelf just behind me, between two volumes of outdated animal encyclopedias. I backed away, refusing to glance down at the shelf again. But something changed in the room as soon as the book was back in place. The smell vanished, replaced by the dry neutrality of old paper and laminate flooring. The air, thick a moment ago, felt lighter. Even the shadows seemed to retreat, pulling inward toward the edges of the room like smoke in reverse. Still, as I left the children's section, I was certain. I heard the gentle creak of a page being turned behind me. At 1:12 a.m., I returned to the main stairwell and took the steps slowly, each footfall echoing just a second longer than seemed natural. Though I tried to focus on the rhythm of my breathing, something about the quiet made every inhale feel too loud. I was climbing toward the director's office, located at the far end of the third floor. A squat hallway, lined with staff portraits and antique event posters that hadn't been touched since the 70s. The air changed the moment I reached the top step. The stillness here wasn't dead like downstairs. It was alert, watchful, the type of quiet you experience when you realize you're not alone, even though you should be. I turned the corner and saw the door to the director's office slightly ajar. I knew with the clarity that comes from the worst sort of intuition that I hadn't left it that way. The rule returned to me with sharp precision. If the furniture in the director's office starts to move by itself, don't react. Light a candle at the entrance to the room and lock the door behind you. Do not return until 2 a.m. I approached with deliberate care, flashlight off, letting the red glow of the exit sign bleed faintly across the corridor. From within the office came the unmistakable sound of wood scraping against linoleum. First, the screech of a desk leg, then the hollow thump of a chair being overturned. I didn't look. I didn't need to. Keeping my eyes downcast, I knelt by the side table where the emergency candle was kept. A book of matches had been tucked beneath it, one corner bent like a page marker, and I struck a flame with trembling fingers. As I lifted the candle to the threshold of the office, the air from inside seemed to pull at it, causing the flame to dance in a strange circular motion, as though something inside were drawing breath. I placed the candle carefully just beyond the frame and shut the door slowly, the hinges shrieking like a wounded thing. Then I turned the lock with a quiet click. The sounds didn't stop right away. I stepped back, counted to 10 in my head, and listened as drawers were yanked open, cabinets slammed shut, paper was shredded or flung against walls with unhinged force. But what I remember most, what I cannot forget, was the slow dragging sound that began after everything else had gone quiet. It was long and deliberate, like something heavy being pulled across the floor, toward the door. I didn't wait for it to reach me. I returned to the hallway, sat in the break room just beyond the stairwell, and waited in silence. I counted every second, refusing to check the clock, until my phone buzzed with a soft vibration. 2 a.m. exactly. When I returned to the office, the candle had gone out. Inside, everything was still. The desk, once pressed neatly against the wall, was skewed diagonally across the room. The bookshelves were emptied, every volume neatly stacked in a pile against the north-facing wall. The carpet bore a single wide groove from the center of the room to the threshold, an indentation with no cause I could discern. I closed the door without stepping inside again, and though I told myself I imagined it, I could have sworn that just before I walked away, I saw the shadows of the furniture shift. At 2:31 a.m., the elevator dinged with the metallic muted chime, like it had been passed through water before reaching the ears. I was walking past the lobby kiosk, just beginning to convince myself that the worst of the night had passed, when that sound cracked the air. I turned toward the elevator and felt a creeping chill work its way up my spine. The panel above the doors didn't display a number. Instead, flickering faintly, it showed a symbol I'd never seen before. 2 horizontal lines stacked close together, like a glitching equal sign. The doors slid open. There was no one inside, of course, but the fluorescent light within the car flickered rapidly, casting shadows that twitched in unnatural rhythms. What disturbed me more, though, was the interior itself. Something was wrong with the proportions. The ceiling seemed lower than usual, and the floor looked slightly slanted, as though gravity itself had taken a step sideways. I took one hesitant step forward, not into the elevator, but just close enough to reach the panel. As I did, a wave of dizziness hit me. The next thing I remember is standing inside the elevator. The doors closed. The light inside the car flickered more violently, and I swear I could feel pressure pushing from within, like the air was trying to escape something that was pressing in behind it. The lift had stopped on a half-second floor. The rule came back with cold clarity. The elevator will occasionally stop on half-second floor. You are not cleared to access this floor. If the doors open, press the close button and recite the alphabet backward. My hand trembled as I jabbed the close button. The doors didn't respond. Something rustled from within the elevator. A dry, whispering shuffle, like pages turning rapidly in a room full of static. And then, from deeper in that slanted car, a voice, fragile and fragmented, like it was made of broken glass. I didn't stop to think. I kept my finger jammed against the button and began reciting the alphabet backward. Z, Y, X, W. The voice hissed again, this time louder, angrier, as though the act of speaking repulsed it, but it could not help trying. The sound crawled through the air like centipede legs brushing my neck. V, U, T, S. The elevator light exploded in a silent collapse, as if all illumination had been sucked inward and crushed. Darkness swelled within the car, thick and cloying, pouring out toward me like a rising tide. R, Q, P, O. The doors finally began to close, groaning with resistance, as though something on the other side was fighting to keep them open. I didn't dare pause. My lips kept moving, the letters falling from my mouth like lifelines. N, M, L. Just before the doors sealed shut, I saw a tall, boneless shape, shifting within the black. Not fully but enough, its silhouette shimmered like heat above pavement. It had no eyes, yet I felt its gaze like ice pressed to the inside of my skull. The doors clicked shut with a finality that echoed down the hallway. I stepped back, chest tight as if someone had wrapped wires around my ribs. The panel above the elevator flickered again, this time returning to a blank screen. The equal lines vanished. I didn't return to the third floor immediately. Instead, I wandered the first floor for a while, pretending to inspect the reading alcoves and empty carrels, my flashlight catching on old posters of author events long since past. I needed the time to calm my nerves, but quiet in this building was expectant, like the air was holding its breath and waiting for something else to go wrong. At 2:54 a.m., I returned to the circulation desk, mostly because I didn't know where else to go. The public catalog computer sat idle on the counter, its screen black. It looked harmless. I was halfway through, unlocking a side drawer, looking for an incident log I thought might exist, when the screen blinked to life behind me. No one touched it. No mouse movement, no keyboard press. But the catalog search bar glowed pale blue. And on its own, the machine began typing. Deliberately, gently, like invisible fingers hovered over unseen keys. The words filled the box with agonizing slowness, as if whatever was controlling it needed to remember how to speak. Never there. Then the enter key depressed without a sound, and the search results populated. The catalog listed only one item. Never there, vault collection, not available for circulation. Restricted access. Its call number was labeled Vault 000, but there was no author or subject matter. The record lacked even a summary. Just a single note in all caps beneath the title. Do not follow what you didn't call. The screen began to flicker rhythmically, like a heartbeat pulsing through old glass. Lines of code briefly flashed in the background, barely visible through the fading catalog window. I stared, transfixed, uncertain what I was even looking for. And then I remembered the rule. If the library catalog computer searches something on its own, let it finish. Do not touch the keyboard until the screen goes black. I stepped back, hands raised like I was facing a feral animal, unsure what movement might set it off. The screen was still pulsing. Then the monitor made a soft crackle. Not quite a sound, more a change in pressure, like the room had shifted slightly around it. And a second message typed itself beneath the catalog record. Someone is reading about you now. The cursor blinked twice and the screen went dark. Every light on the monitor winked out, and the moment it did, the silence changed. I don't know how else to describe it. The hum of distant pipes stopped. The faint electric buzz of fluorescent lighting disappeared. Even the subtle natural shifting of old wood and concrete went still. The lights overhead flickered once. Not enough to trigger the next rule. Not yet. I think it was just a reminder for me. I remained frozen at the desk, watching the black screen for any return flicker, but it stayed dead. Behind me, in the long-shadowed hallway that led toward the archives, I thought I heard something drag slowly across the floor, a sound like a length of thick cloth being pulled across tile. But I didn't move toward it. The building's atmosphere had curdled into something heavy, almost liquid. Every footstep felt muffled by an unseen weight. When I breathed, the air tasted like paper left too long in a flooded basement. I climbed the stairs to the second floor. I knew better than to linger near the archives vault at this hour. I had learned to move with purpose, but not enough to draw attention. I'd only just reached the mezzanine when I saw him. At first glance, I assumed it was another late-night custodian. A tall figure with precise practiced motions, shelving books one at a time along the long nonfiction aisle. He moved with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had been doing this task for decades. No wasted effort, no fumbling. But something was wrong. His movements were identical. Each time he reached for a book, his arm extended in exactly the same arc. Each time he slotted it onto the shelf, his hand flattened at the same angle. It was repetition, which is not inherent in any living person. His uniform looked like something from another era. At first, it looked like the standard dark sweater and slacks worn by older library staff. But as I edged closer, I saw the cut of the fabric was outdated, like something out of the 1940s. The cuffs were too wide, the collar too high, the buttons dulled with age and cracked down the center, like old porcelain. His shoes gleamed despite the dust. Polished black leather, almost militaristic in their shine. He turned slightly, not facing me, but enough that I caught the profile of his face. His features were long, his cheekbones sharp, and his skin impossibly pale, the tone of faded newsprint. His eyes were locked on the shelves, scanning with precise determination. The worst part, though, worse than the uncanny symmetry of his movement, or the way he seemed to vibrate faintly at the edges, was the wooden cart beside him. It was old-fashioned, with brass accents and a cracked wheel, and on that cart sat only one book. Every time he placed it back on the shelf, it reappeared on the cart seconds later. Not a copy, the same book. I recognized its warped spine and worn binding, the exact tear in the lower left corner of its cover. He wasn't shelving different books. He was trapped in a loop, endlessly returning the same cursed volume. And I had interrupted him by simply seeing what I wasn't supposed to. Rule 6. If you see a tall man in an outdated librarian's uniform shelving books, do not interrupt him. Leave that floor immediately. I turned at once, not quickly or suddenly, just a calm, steady walk, as if nothing was wrong, as if I hadn't noticed him at all. The moment my foot touched the first step of the stairwell, I heard the squeal of a rolling cartwheel behind me. The cart was moving, getting closer and closer. Something tapped the banister behind me. Refusing to look back, I descended, gripping the railing too tightly as my heart tried to punch through my ribs. I counted the stairs in my head, desperate for distraction. I made it to the first floor, and as soon as I turned the corner into the staff corridor, the sensation lifted. Like a sudden pressure vanishing from behind my ears. The air lightened. My heartbeat slowed from full panic to a manageable tremor. I didn't know what the thing on the second floor wanted, but I hadn't broken the rule, and that was the only reason I was still breathing. The hallway lights hummed faintly overhead as I returned to the ground floor security office. I didn't sit. I didn't even close the door. The chair behind the desk looked empty, too inviting, as if it had been waiting for me, and I wasn't in the mood to see what might happen if I let my guard down completely. Instead, I stood by the cracked window, sipping cold coffee and watching the parking lot dissolve into mist. My nerves were still frayed. I could still hear that warped wheel somewhere in the marrow of my bones, turning endlessly in the dark. At 3:07 a.m., I heard the knocking. It was subtle, just a faint thump, like an old pipe adjusting to the night. I barely registered it at first. Buildings like this had their own creaks, their own nocturnal language, and I'd already heard more than my fair share of it. But the sound didn't fade. It grew louder. 3 slow, heavy knocks. A pause. Then again 3 knocks, this time faster. Shivers ran down my spine. I stepped back from the window and leaned toward the hallway. The vault. It was coming from the archives vault. Rule 7. Between 3 a.m. and 3:30 a.m., you may hear knocking from inside the archives vault. It is imperative that you do not respond, especially if it knows your name. Another knock, then a whisper. James. The voice wasn't distorted or guttural. It was my mother's, the one I hadn't spoken to in nearly a year. Not since her memory had started slipping and her words began fraying around the edges of reality. She hadn't said my name like that, gently and warmly, in a long time. James, open the door please. I'm scared. There was texture to her voice. It rolled down the corridor like breath on the back of my neck. A sick familiar intimacy. Something mimicking her affection, clinging to memory like mold to damp walls. I stepped into the hallway and moved slowly, my legs operating without my permission. The corridor to the archives stretched long and narrow, lined with fluorescent lights that buzzed just slightly out of sync. The heavy metallic vault door stood at the end with its combination lock, gleaming under the cold light. Jamie, it's so cold in here. Give me a hug. My chest tightened. No one had called me that since I was 9. For a moment, I thought I felt her breath on the other side of the vault door. Warm, uneven, like she'd pressed her lips to the steel. "Please, Jamie. It's so dark here." Tears came to my eyes, unbidden and bitter. Not because I believed it was her, but because whatever was in there knew what to say. It knew my grief, knew what I missed. I backed away slowly, forcing myself to return to the lobby. I stood in the middle of the rotunda, beneath the stained glass dome that filtered the moonlight into fractured colors. The knocking continued, softer now, pleading. Then I heard the last whisper. "I'm proud of you, Jamie." By the time I glanced at the clock again, the hands hovered just past 3:48 a.m. The library felt unbalanced, like a house where all the furniture had been moved just an inch out of place. Not enough to notice immediately, but enough to feel. I tried to focus on the cameras again, but the monitors flickered, static bleeding in at the corners of the feed. The third-floor hallway looped back on itself, twice in a single second before freezing entirely. The display from the children's section briefly flashed a frame that showed no books on the shelves, just empty rows, stretching on forever into a black starless void. The lights began to flicker. At first, I thought it was just in my office, but when I stepped into the hallway, I saw the entire library stuttering with rhythmic pulses, like it was breathing through clenched teeth. Fluorescent tubes above me blinked erratically, casting jittering shapes against the walls and floor. Rule 8. If the lights flicker continuously, power down the building from the breaker room and wait 77 seconds. The breaker room was tucked behind the loading dock, at the back of the building. A narrow concrete hallway that always felt colder than the rest of the library. I'd passed it a few times earlier in the night, never needing to step inside. Now I was moving quickly, the beam of my flashlight bouncing across unfamiliar shadows as I passed row after row of stacks. The lights above me stuttered like a heartbeat too fast to be human. And then I noticed something worse. Each flicker brought a new angle, a shifted outline. Long-limbed silhouettes that didn't match the bookshelves or the angles of the architecture. They stretched where they shouldn't, curled like talons when they met the floor. One of them lingered a fraction too long before melting away. I broke into a jog, down the staff hallway, past the old boiler, into the breaker room. The door was steel, painted gray, and cold to the touch. I shut it behind me, twisted the bolt, and turned to the panel. Rows of switches rusting slightly at the edges. A laminated sheet above them with emergency shutdown instructions. I flipped the master breaker. The entire library went dead. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I pointed it at the closed door. No sound came from the other side. I slid down the wall, sat on the cold concrete floor, and began to count. 1, 2, 3. The darkness was not empty. Somewhere, faintly, I heard the soft scrape of nails on glass. It was rhythmic, deliberate, a tapping against one of the library's many windows, too faint to determine which. I tightened my grip on the flashlight and forced myself to keep counting aloud. 40, 41. A low hum joined the tapping. Maybe even a moan? No, it was layered, like multiple throats trying to harmonize and failing miserably, twisting into dissonance. The floor vibrated slightly beneath me, as if something heavy had moved just overhead. 68, 69. My voice cracked. I gritted my teeth and forced the numbers out anyway. 75, 76, 77. The moment I whispered the final number, the breaker panel clicked loudly and the room surged back to life. The lights snapped on. I pulled the master switch back up, and the hum vanished. But something else had changed. The silence was deeper now, more complete. I hesitated at the door, ear pressed against the metal. And as I stepped out into the hallway, flashlight in hand, I noticed a single line of frozen footprints leading away from the breaker room, as if someone had been standing just outside the door the entire time. I didn't want to come back, not after what I'd seen and heard in that vault. The first night had hollowed me out, left me raw, like an organ pulled from the body and left beating on the cold tile floor. Yet, against my better judgment, I returned. The second night began without fanfare. The sky was already dark when I parked behind the library. The lot was empty, and the building loomed above me like a mausoleum, its windows faintly reflecting the flicker of passing headlights. For a moment, I sat behind the wheel, key still in the ignition, half convinced I could drive away and never look back. But the note on my dashboard, written in my own handwriting, though I had no memory of placing it, said only, "Finish what you started." I checked the time-stamped log from the previous shift. No whispers in the vault. No frozen footprints trailing from the breaker room. Nothing. It was as though none of it had happened, except that the master key on my ring now included one I didn't recognize. Old, brass and slightly bent. It had been added sometime after dawn. By 11:50 p.m., I was doing my second walkthrough of the main floor. Everything was too quiet. Not even the subtle background noise of an old structure settling into itself reached my ears. The silence felt like a rubber sheet pulled too tight. I passed the central reading area and stopped cold. Someone had moved the chairs. 6 of them now formed a perfect equidistant circle centered beneath the massive skylight. The kind of symmetrical precision that only draws attention in its unnaturalness. And resting on the table in the center of that circle was the book from last night. The one that had fallen open near the director's office. But I had placed it back on the shelf. Hadn't I? I approached slowly. The air seemed thinner the closer I got, like oxygen itself was reluctant to fill my lungs. I kept my flashlight trained on the book. Its cover was open again, pages ruffling in a draft I could not feel. Rule 2. If you find a book open on the floor with no one around, close it immediately and place it on the nearest shelf without reading the title. I hadn't broken that rule. I was sure. But the book was here again. A taunt maybe, or a warning. I stepped inside the circle, keeping my breathing steady, and shut it with a soft thump. Then I walked to the nearest shelf and slid it into place. Somewhere in fiction, under a name I didn't bother to read. Only when I turned around did I see a motionless figure. Far down the hallway, just outside the archives door. He wore the uniform of a librarian. Not the standard company polo, but something older, from another era entirely. High-waisted trousers, a starched collar, sleeves rolled to the forearms. And on his chest, a nameplate, Mr. Barnes. His head tilted slightly when our eyes met. There was no malice or kindness in his eyes, just attention. He wasn't shelving anything. Not yet. But I didn't wait. I walked away, not rushed, but purposeful, and didn't check over my shoulder. I simply moved toward the central stairwell and descended to the first floor, heart hammering like fists against locked doors. Back in my office, I locked the door behind me and pulled the blinds shut. My hands trembled as I sipped coffee from a chipped mug. Every tick of the clock sounded too loud, and beneath the hum of electricity, I swore I could hear paper turning, as though the building itself was reading. When I checked the cameras again, Mr. Barnes was shelving books in local history. Nothing that goes beyond the rules. Still, I turned the monitor off, and somehow that was worse than watching him. As the clock approached midnight, I realized something else. Something I hadn't noticed in the chaos of last night. The silence was growing. It breathed, like something vast exhaling beneath the foundation, shifting unseen in the dark seams of the building. It had followed me from the stairwell, down into the break room where I sat hunched with my back to the corner, nursing the dull pressure in my skull. The kind that creeps behind the eyes and builds like static in the brain. I dozed off without meaning to, maybe for 5 minutes. When I woke, the lights in the office were off, even though I hadn't touched the switch. A clean, sharp crash rang out from the corridor behind circulation. The sound of something heavy hitting the floor and sliding. I jerked upright and yanked the office door open. A chair was in the middle of the hallway, overturned, the kind that belongs at the reference desk. But there was no desk nearby. It had been dragged. Long screeching grooves stretched along the tile, where its legs had scraped across. I flinched as the light from my flashlight illuminated the wall behind me. Someone had scratched a set of words on it. Printer. Do not read. Mistake. With overwhelming horror, I remembered that I had broken the rule at the very beginning of my first night. Not even intentionally. The printer, the pages it spat out on the first night. I had picked it up and read the title. I'd stared at the strange catalog data printed in smeared black ink, unable to make sense of them. The text had bled under the words, like the paper was soaking up ink from some invisible reservoir. I should have left it. A soft rattling began behind the stacks, hardcovers leaping from their homes, flung as though hurled by unseen hands. I stood frozen, back pressed to the wall, as the library lost its mind. Shelves shook. A globe from the children's section rolled past at impossible speed, its base shattered. A paperback spun across the floor like a shuriken and struck the wall with a sound of dry meat. My flashlight flickered, even though the batteries hadn't been low. Every instinct screamed at me to bolt, to dive for the emergency exit and never look back. But I moved slowly, breathing shallow and even. The building groaned overhead, a low, seismic creak that came from something above the ceiling, something pacing in long, deliberate steps. Glass shattered 2 aisles over. I rounded the corner slowly and stopped dead in my tracks. In front of me, hanging motionless in midair, was a library stool. One of the heavy metal ones. It hovered 3 feet off the ground, slowly rotating in place. Suddenly, a stool shot forward, striking the wall to my right with a metallic scream, leaving a deep dent in the drywall. I stood in the middle of the debris, shaking. Someone's breath fogged the air beside me. A single word hissed right beside my skull. Run! I realized that it was a trap, set by that damn thing. So I walked slowly, down the hallway toward the reference wing. Around me, the temperature began to rise again. No more falling books or slamming chairs. Back in the office, I found the brass key again. The one that hadn't been there the night before last. Now it was warm and greasy in my hand, as though it had just been held. I stayed behind the filing cabinet and tried not to weep. The digital clock blinked 4 a.m. I pulled myself up, muscles aching, and moved through the library with the slow precision of someone sweeping for tripwires. The upper floors were quiet now. I spent the next 12 minutes on the 3rd floor, checking the breaker closet after the last flicker of the overhead lights. I didn't have much faith in breakers anymore, but routine grounded me. When I stepped out, I noticed something new. A trail of pages. Torn, yellowing sheets scattered down the carpet like breadcrumbs. Each was covered in symbols. The trail led to the rare materials room. I followed it. The smell hit my nose. Old dust, burnt paper, and something sickly sweet beneath it. The room was dim, lit only by the moonlight, streaming in through the high windows. On the central table sat a single book, opened wide. Around it, dozens of candles flickered in still air. I approached, every nerve on fire. The book was handwritten, bound in a cracked leather cover so old it had begun to flake. The pages curled inward at the corners. On the first line of the open page, I saw my full name, middle initial, and birth date. From behind me, the door clicked shut. I spun. No one was there, but the lock had turned. The doorknob was cold, unyielding. Then, from 3 floors below, through layers of concrete and stairwell, I heard the rhythmic churn of something being printed. The candles flickered harder, some went out, and I saw it. A terrible anthropomorphic creature stood where the door had been, hunched and stretched, wearing scraps of a librarian's uniform from a century ago. His head was too far forward, as if sniffing the air. Jaw hung open, splitting vertically. Inside, where should have been a throat, there were fluttering pages. The creature hissed, tilted its head like a dog hearing a distant whistle, and recoiled in recognition. Then it turned and walked backward into the shelves, vanishing spine first into the rows of silent books. Dawn was breaking. I didn't remember leaving the building. I only knew I was standing in the parking lot, blood dried under my nose, hands shaking, the taste of paper on my tongue. They didn't renew my contract. No explanation, just a quiet phone call 2 days later, from someone who wouldn't give their name, saying the library would be adjusting their policies. I didn't ask what that meant. I didn't want to know. After this night shifts, I started to dream about that damn printer. Sometimes, I wake up and hear it whirring in the other room, though I don't own one. Yesterday, I found a page under my pillow, written in the same twisted handwriting. I burned it, but fire doesn't always stop a story. Sometimes it just makes the next chapter louder.